Welcome to True Crime Threads. Today we uncover the chilling story of a boy driven to murder by a rare condition. Cassian had always been an ordinary boy in a small, quiet town. He was well liked by his classmates, excelling in his studies, and always found time to help his neighbors with little tasks. His parents were proud of him, and his future seemed bright. He was a typical teenager with hopes and dreams, never giving anyone any reason to believe that anything could go wrong. That was until the day his life changed forever. It began with strange behavior that no one could explain. Cassian, once a healthy, energetic boy, started complaining of unusual cravings. It began subtly at first, an overwhelming desire to chew on pencils or gnaw on objects like paper. His parents assumed it was just a phase, something that would pass with time. But it didn't. The urges continued, growing stronger by the day, and Cassian began to show signs of a deeper problem. He would wander the house aimlessly, staring at objects with an unsettling intensity, as though struggling to resist an unseen force. When he started eating things he found outside the house, like dirt and leaves, his parents became concerned. At first, they thought it might be a result of stress or some underlying medical issue. They took him to the family doctor, who, after some initial tests, referred them to a specialist. What they were about to discover would turn their world upside down. Cassian was diagnosed with pica syndrome, an extremely rare and baffling condition where individuals feel a compulsive urge to eat non-food items. While most cases involve children eating things like chalk or dirt, Cassian's condition was different. His cravings were far more disturbing. He began consuming objects that were not only bizarre but dangerous, things like paper clips, pieces of glass, and even plastic. The family tried everything to help him: therapy, special diets, and medications, but nothing worked. The cravings became stronger, and Cassian seemed to grow more distant from his family and friends. His behavior began to shift in ways that were not just concerning but frightening. Doctors were baffled. No one had ever seen a case of pica like this before, especially not one that seemed to escalate so quickly. Cassian's medical team worked tirelessly, but nothing they did seemed to make a difference. His parents were desperate, trying to keep him safe, but they had no idea how to help him. His condition was consuming him, not just physically but mentally as well. He was becoming someone they didn't recognize. The gentle, bright boy they had raised was slipping away, replaced by someone struggling with an insatiable need he could not control. As time passed, Cassian's strange cravings took a more disturbing turn. He began to eat raw meat uncooked, unprocessed, and increasingly bizarre. At first, his parents thought it was a phase, but soon they could no longer deny that something much darker was at play. Cassian himself seemed unaware of the depth of his actions, caught in a trance-like state as his urges took hold. His family could only watch in horror as their son became a prisoner of his own mind, each day bringing a new layer of fear and confusion. Cassian's condition was no longer something they could control; it was taking over, and they feared what might come next. It started with small, seemingly innocent actions that no one could have predicted would lead to something much darker. Cassian's parents noticed him chewing on the edge of his textbooks, the spines of his favorite novels, even his own clothing. At first, it was brushed off as nervous habits, but as the days passed, his behavior grew stranger. He would bite off chunks of his pencil, gnaw on the corners of his desk, and sometimes even eat the pages of books he was supposed to be reading for school. The odd habits didn't seem to faze him. He acted as though he couldn't stop, as if an invisible force was guiding his every move. One evening, Cassian disappeared from the house. His parents weren't immediately alarmed. He had taken walks before to clear his head or to gather his thoughts. But hours passed, and he didn't return. His mother grew uneasy, and when she asked his father to go look for him, they both assumed he had just wandered off. But when night fell and there was still no sign of Cassian, panic began to set in. They contacted the police, who started a search, hoping to find him before anything went wrong. It wasn't until the next morning that Cassian came back home, covered in dirt and blood. His clothes were torn, and his face was expressionless, as if he was in some sort of trance. His parents rushed to him, asking where he had been, but Cassian could offer no explanation. His eyes seemed distant, as though he didn't recognize them. He was silent for a long time, barely responding to their frantic questions. The only thing he seemed capable of saying was, "I don't know," as if even he couldn't understand what had happened to him. When the police arrived to investigate, they noticed Cassian's strange appearance and immediately began questioning him further. They had been searching for a missing woman, Emily Harper, who had been last seen the previous evening. Cassian's strange behavior and his unaccountable return from the woods raised suspicions. He could not recall what had happened during the time he was gone, but the evidence surrounding him was troubling. There were traces of blood on his clothes, and his hands were smeared with something unrecognizable. The investigation into Emily Harper's disappearance led the police into the forest near where Cassian had been seen. What they found was chilling her lifeless body, partially hidden beneath a cluster of trees. There were no obvious signs of physical injury, but forensic experts discovered that part of her remains had been consumed. The truth hit like a punch to the gut. The authorities couldn't yet prove that Cassian had killed Emily, but they knew the grim details of the case were pointing in his direction. Her body had been left in the woods for hours, and with Cassian's unexplained return, the situation seemed all too clear. Cassian was taken in for questioning, though his memory of the night's events remained fragmented and incomplete. As he sat in the interrogation room, he appeared confused and overwhelmed, unable to offer any coherent explanation. The more the investigators pressed him, the more Cassian seemed to shrink into himself, almost as though he was afraid of what he might have done. But no one, not even his parents, could deny the haunting reality that their son had somehow been involved in a gruesome, unspeakable crime. Though he couldn't remember what happened in the woods, something deep within Cassian knew that this was only the beginning of a much darker path. The whispers around town grew louder, and Cassian's parents could no longer hide the truth from themselves. Their son, the boy they had once known, was not just suffering from a rare disorder. He was becoming a monster, something beyond their control. As Cassian's condition worsened, his once peaceful life in the small town began to unravel. His parents, desperate for answers, continued seeking help from various specialists, but no one could offer a solution that seemed to make a difference. The boy they had raised, the one who had once been full of life and potential, was slipping further away, replaced by someone unrecognizable. While some townspeople expressed sympathy for Cassian, many others began to fear him. Whispers spread, with people wondering if his rare medical condition was truly to blame, or if something far more sinister was at play. As Cassian grew older, his cravings became even more uncontrollable. No longer was it just objects like paper and dirt that he consumed. His urges escalated to more disturbing levels. He began to take raw meat from the refrigerator, gnawing on it in secrecy. His parents, horrified but helpless, could no longer ignore the terrifying reality that Cassian's condition was evolving into something much darker. There were moments when Cassian seemed almost like his old self, moments where the sweet, caring boy would surface again, only to be quickly overtaken by the madness that lurked beneath. He became withdrawn, isolating himself from his family and friends. No one could understand what he was going through. His mother often tried to comfort him, but Cassian would pull away, too ashamed of what he had become. His father, frustrated and powerless, could only watch as his son's mental state deteriorated. The true horror, however, began when Cassian's cravings led him to seek out something more than just raw meat. At first, he wasn't even aware of what he was doing. He simply followed the compulsion, as if his body was acting on its own. The night of the first incident, he went into the nearby woods, a place he had often walked to clear his mind. But this time, something was different. Cassian's eyes were wild with hunger, and his senses were heightened. He found himself following the smell of something that triggered his deepest, most terrifying cravings. It wasn't long before he encountered Liam, his closest friend. Liam had been a constant in Cassian's life, someone who had always been there for him, even as Cassian's behavior grew more erratic. He had tried to talk to his friend to understand what was happening, but Cassian was growing more difficult to reach. On that fateful night, Liam found Cassian in the woods, sitting in a strange, trance-like state. Despite the eerie stillness that surrounded him, Liam approached him, calling his name. Cassian's eyes, wide and unfocused, slowly turned toward him. But something had changed in Cassian. The boy he had once known was gone, replaced by a creature driven by an insatiable hunger. In a flash, Cassian attacked, pulling Liam to the ground with a strength that seemed impossible for someone his size. Liam struggled, but Cassian's grip was unyielding, and in his delirium he did something that no one could have anticipated. The next morning, the search for Liam began. Friends, family, and authorities scoured the woods, but there was no sign of him until Cassian was found wandering aimlessly near the edge of town. He appeared disoriented, covered in dirt and blood, and once again he couldn't explain what had happened. His hands were stained, his eyes vacant, and a part of him seemed to know that something terrible had taken place, but the full scope of his actions remained a mystery to him. Liam was never seen again, and as the investigation deepened, all signs pointed to Cassian. Though he could not recall what had happened, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Evidence found in the woods, including bloodstains and pieces of clothing, suggested a brutal encounter. Forensic experts were left with no other explanation. Cassian had killed his best friend, though his mind couldn't fully comprehend the horror of what he had done. The question now became whether Cassian was a victim of his own mind or something far worse. As the investigation into Liam's disappearance continued, the town's unease grew. Cassian had become the focal point of a case that seemed to grow more chilling with each passing day. The whispers around town grew louder, and some people began to fear that Cassian wasn't just suffering from a medical condition, but that he had become a monster capable of unspeakable acts. His parents, already distraught over their son's condition, found themselves trapped in a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. They couldn't fathom that the boy they loved, the one who had once been so full of life, was capable of such violence. Cassian's mother, in particular, struggled with the guilt and heartbreak of watching her son descend into madness. She had known for some time that something was terribly wrong, but she had kept it a secret from everyone, even her husband. For years, she had hoped that Cassian's strange cravings and behavior were part of a phase, something that would pass with time. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. She had tried to protect him, to shield him from the harsh judgments of the outside world. She couldn't bear the thought of anyone knowing the full truth about what was happening to her son, so she kept the details of his condition hidden. But after Liam's disappearance and the mounting evidence that pointed to Cassian, his mother could no longer keep the secret. She was racked with guilt over the role she had played in allowing Cassian's condition to go unchecked for so long. She had hoped for a miracle, but as each day passed, the truth became harder to ignore. Cassian's behavior was no longer something they could manage on their own. It was out of control. In a desperate attempt to understand what was happening to her son, Cassian's mother finally broke her silence. She went to the authorities and shared the full story, revealing the rare condition Cassian had been diagnosed with years earlier. She explained how the doctors had told them that Cassian's cravings were linked to pica syndrome, but it wasn't just any form of the condition. It was something far more sinister, something that seemed to be evolving into a terrifying force within him. The police were skeptical at first, unsure of how much weight to give her claims. But when Cassian was brought in for further questioning, a new set of events began to unfold. The authorities sought out specialists who could better understand the complexities of Cassian's behavior, and it was during these medical examinations that a shocking discovery was made. Cassian's condition, it seemed, was not only linked to pica syndrome. It was far worse than anyone had anticipated. Scans revealed a tumor in his brain, pressing on the areas responsible for impulse control and emotional regulation. This tumor, doctors explained, was likely the cause of Cassian's uncontrollable cravings and violent tendencies. It was a discovery that shocked everyone, offering a glimmer of understanding about why Cassian had been acting the way he had, but it didn't make his actions any less horrifying. The tumor explained why Cassian had been unable to control his urges, but it did not absolve him of the crimes he had committed. The town was divided. Some believed that Cassian was a victim of his own body, that his condition and the tumor were to blame for the horrors he had inflicted. Others, however, could not ignore the brutal facts the boy had killed, and no explanation could change the terror that had spread through the community. Cassian's parents were left to grapple with the devastating truth their son had become a killer, and while they now understood the medical reasons behind his actions, it didn't make the pain of his crimes any easier to bear. And though the diagnosis of the tumor provided some clarity, it also raised even more disturbing questions. What did this mean for Cassian's future? Could he ever be treated? Or had he crossed a line that couldn't be undone? Cassian's condition deteriorated rapidly after the shocking discovery of the tumor in his brain. Doctors warned his parents that his urges would only intensify, and the possibility of further violent outbursts became a terrifying reality. Though the tumor had been diagnosed, there was little that could be done. Surgery was risky, and it wasn't guaranteed that it would stop the cravings or the violent episodes. His mind was slipping further, and his parents found themselves constantly on edge, fearing what he might do next. Cassian's mother, who had been his primary caretaker, struggled with the guilt of everything that had happened. She had kept his condition a secret for so long, trying to protect him, trying to believe that he could overcome the challenges he faced. But now, with the tumor's existence confirmed, she feared for her own safety. She loved her son deeply, but she couldn't ignore the darkness that had taken hold of him. In her heart, she knew that she was no longer able to protect him, or herself, from the dangers that seemed to loom over them. One night, everything came to a devastating head. Cassian's mother woke to find him standing at the foot of her bed, his eyes blank and vacant, his body trembling. The expression on his face was a mix of confusion and hunger, a disturbing combination that sent chills down her spine. She tried to speak to him to calm him down, but Cassian's mind was lost. The tumor had taken full control. In a flash of rage and confusion, Cassian attacked his mother. She didn't stand a chance. Her screams echoed through the house, but it was too late. Cassian, driven by an overwhelming compulsion, overpowered her with terrifying strength. His hands, covered in blood, shook as he stood over her lifeless body. The horror of what he had done hit him like a wave, but it was too late to stop the damage. Cassian didn't understand what had happened. The darkness that had clouded his mind dissipated, and for a moment he looked around in confusion. His mother's body lay before him, her life snuffed out in an instant. But the horror of his actions didn't register in his mind. He couldn't remember how it had happened or why. The guilt and terror that should have flooded him were replaced with an unsettling numbness. The authorities arrived at the scene hours later, having been alerted by Cassian's father, who had come home to find the unimaginable. When the police questioned Cassian, he was silent. He couldn't explain what had happened, couldn't recall any of the events leading up to his mother's death. He seemed confused and distant, as if the act itself had been committed by someone else, not the son who had once been so full of promise. As Cassian was arrested and taken into custody, he remained eerily calm, his eyes vacant and distant. He couldn't remember killing his mother. The terrifying, brutal act that had forever shattered his family was a blur, a shadow that he couldn't grasp. He couldn't even recall the events of the previous nights, the violent urges, the blood, the rage. He was a prisoner of his own mind, lost in a maze of confusion and horror that he could not escape. The trial that followed was a tragic one. The evidence of his mother's death was undeniable, but Cassian's defense argued that his actions had been a result of the tumor, a medical condition that had controlled his impulses and left him unable to comprehend the consequences of his actions. The town, still reeling from the deaths of both Liam and his mother, was divided. Some believed that Cassian was a victim of his own mind, a boy whose illness had led him down a path of violence. Others couldn't reconcile the fact that a young man had killed not just one but two people, with no remorse, and with no memory of the events at all. Cassian was eventually sentenced to life in a psychiatric facility, where he would remain under constant care. The boy who had once been so full of life and potential was now a shell of the person he had once been, his future uncertain. The tragedy that had unfolded in that small town left an indelible mark on everyone involved, and Cassian's story would become a haunting reminder of how a rare medical condition, coupled with a hidden darkness, can lead to unspeakable consequences.